One of my last recordings, I was trying to figure out what we mean by the term morality. I think one thing that got fleshed out was that if you imagine a world in which there is no sentient beings, in that world, the term morality wouldn't even make sense. It would really make no difference to anyone if you destroyed that world, if, meteor hit it and it was destroyed, or if it was protected. Morality doesn't make sense in this world, but the moment we introduce the notion of sentience, the moment we have a world with beings who have, on the one hand, experiences, subjectivity, or what have been called qualia. So there is something it is like to be those organisms. They have a felt sense of being, like what it's like to be a bat. And the moment they not only have experiences, but they stand in an evaluative relationship to those experiences. In other words, the key phrase that we were using last time was there is something that makes a difference to them, right? It makes a difference to them whether they are in a mental state, in a state of experience, or not, or they're in a different state. For example, typical subjective experiences like hunger bring this to the table. These words are not only descriptions of what it's like, of something subjective, but inherently describe an evaluative relationship. Hunger comes not only as the experience of hunger, but with you not wanting to be in that state, with you having an evaluative relationship towards that mental state. And this is what we called appetite last time. So the moment you have beings that have appetite, in most of our subjective experiences are of this nature. They come as a form of appetite. They really literally draw you towards something and repel you from something else. The moment you have such a world, again, with experience, subjectivity, and these experiences making a difference to someone, the word morality suddenly starts to make sense. You couldn't say that destroying that world would have no moral consequences. We immediately feel there's something wrong the moment there is a world with sentient beings in it. And this independently of theological definitions of morality. It really doesn't matter how you define morality. You have a felt sense that there is a difference between something happening to this world, which inhabits beings and has sentience in it, to which we could answer the question, well, is there somebody there? We would say, yes, there is somebody there, right? It doesn't mean there have to be humans there, but the moment that you have experiencing beings there, and beings that have an evaluative relationship towards their experiences, you can answer, yes, there is somebody there. I think most of us would intuitively say, yeah, there is somebody there. And that world being destroyed is significantly factually different for us than a world being destroyed which is devoid of experience, where there are no living organisms or anything that might be a bearer of consciousness of any form, or anything that might say of itself, not only do I experience, but it makes to me a difference whether I experience this or that, or whether I experience something or nothing at all. In other words, whether it makes a difference to them whether they die or live. This is one of the most foundational, again, experiences you can have as a sentient being, the distinction between life and death, which is not just a fact, it's something that comes as a form of experience, manifesting itself as fear from death, and but this is a different topic. And it's interesting how suddenly the term morality starts making sense in this second case, even though it's not clear what it means, but it seems obvious that it just doesn't match reality. If you said, well, my actions have only physical consequences. If I destroy this world through my actions, this world which has sentient beings in it, there are only physical consequences. There are some certain beings which start shrieking and shouting and screaming in the experience of being dissolved. But this is like the squeaking of a door. That's not the reality of it. The reality of it is that your actions don't have only physical consequences, but they have subjective consequences, if you want. They have consequences on the subjectivity of those involved beings. Those beings have a subjectivity. By definition, we define this world to be one in which there are experiencing beings. And your actions have a consequence to the subjectivity of those beings. And that's just as real as reality can get. This is just as real as physical reality. Actions having physical consequences is as real as actions having subjective consequences. This is the consequences on the subjectivity of somebody else who's involved in some form through your actions. Just as your actions, as Searle puts it, have consequences on social reality. Social reality is just as real as physical reality. And the moment you have a world which has experiencing beings, which have subjectivity, and those beings are in relationship to each other, which, in other words, as Wilber puts it, perceive each other, they have a social reality. They have a social dimension. And your actions impinge not only on the physical, not only on the subjective, but they also impinge on the social, on the intersubjective as well. And again, this is just a factual description. It is something that is real about your actions. And if you then introduce the notion of morality into the picture, we see that the notion of morality, the term morality, independently of how you define it now, just by feeling into how we already use the term, we figure out, hey, wait a minute, there is something in the term that tells us exactly that our actions have not only physical consequences, but they have consequences on the subjectivity of others. The term morality actually is naming something that we already kind of know, that our actions impinge not only on physical reality, they impinge also on subjective reality. And this is what we name. At least it's weird that the term makes sense when we apply it to this world, which bears subjectivity, where we feel that destroying that world would be not a moral action. Even we might not know the details of why yet, but we immediately feel there's something that's not right. Because what's happening here is significantly different. It's differently real from what would be happening if that world was not inhibited by any forms of life, any form of experience. Again, the crucial part is not life, but the crucial part is experience, and particularly a evaluative relationship toward that experience. These are two different actions, and they impinge on different aspects of reality. And we wouldn't be even able to name that if we didn't use terms like, for example, morality. Morality is just a term that helps us point out that distinction, point out the reality of that, point out the reality of your actions having consequences on the social and the subjective as much as they do on the physical. And this is what we introduced into the picture. What we introduced into the picture is that actions can have consequences for the subjectivity of others. And when that subjectivity of others is impinged in a way that their basic evaluative relationship, their appetite, in other words, what they want to be, or their interests, if you want, are impinged on, basically by definition, your action impinging on those interests is that which would be defined as bad. In other words, what bad means in this context, or evil has a different connotation here, but let's stick with the word bad maybe, or immoral. What it simply would mean in this context would be that you are, one-to-one, it would simply mean that your actions are impinging on the interests of others. Your actions have consequences for first-person reality of other beings. And now, of course, many would ask, well, wait a minute, if that's immoral, first of all, why would I call it immoral? I might not use the term at all. And secondly, like, why would I refrain from doing that? What would stop me doing that? Like, what would force me to take those calls to actions that are directed at me by those beings? What would force me to respond to them, right? To not just act out of my own will and out of my own interests, but what would force me to actually take those interests into account and listen and respond to them? This is not answered by this at all. And it's not supposed to answer it. It's rather supposed to help those who already have the intuition that they're interested in listening, who already have a sense that, hey, wait a minute, but what else would I do in my life? Right? How else would I spend my life more meaningfully than by listening, and then by looking for calls of others, and by responding to those calls and finding pleasure in precisely doing that. It's very much like spending your life listening to music, finding beautiful form in music, and finding pleasure in precisely that experience for no other reason, for no external reason than the experience itself. It is as if some of us find pleasure in the very act of being aware, of appreciating and responding to the world. Some of us don't need external reasons for why to do this. For some of us, this is the way we find ourselves, the way we find meaning for ourselves, the way we realize ourselves as beings and individuals. By listening, by being receptive to the world. Now, of course, this won't convince anybody else, but I think it makes a bit more comprehensible to those of us who already share this intuition what we use the term morality for. And in this context, we use it to designate that our actions impinge on the subjectivity and on the interests of other sentient beings who not only experience, but again, to whom it makes a difference what they experience. And by living up to moral expectations, all we do, nothing more and nothing less, is simply to respond to the calls of others. Simply to listen and to respond in such a way that your actions are coordinated with the social reality and with the psychological reality, the first person reality, if you want, as Wilber puts it, of other human beings. Because this is to us as real as third person of physical reality. And this is to us as interesting and as relevant as physical reality or third person reality. And again, this is an intuition. You either share this intuition and it feels like this is what I want morality to mean, or you don't. Then I think there isn't much that would actually change your position.